The next speaker is a lady. She's called MADY MANTHA, and she works at RASA. She says of herself that she is a space enthusiast and a technical evangelist. Actually, she works with AI assistants, and the motto of her company is that AI assistants can really help customers. So that's what they do, and that's what she will talk about today. Welcome, MADY.
Awesome, thank you. Well, hey everyone, welcome. I'm MADY MANTHA, and I do product evangelism at RASA. Really excited to be here and to talk to you about something that I'm really passionate about, and that's building conversational AI for the enterprise. So just a quick intro into RASA before we begin. RASA is a standard infrastructure layer for conversational AI. It's open source, right? So if you're a company or a team building virtual assistants, you'd use RASA to make that happen. On the most basic level, right, there's two things that you need to do when you're building AI assistants, or rather an assistant needs to be able to do two things. First, it needs to be able to understand what a user is saying, and then it needs to decide what to do in response. And a RASA assistant uses machine learning to accomplish both natural language understanding and dialogue management. And companies embracing digital transformation across different verticals and industries use RASA to build mission-critical AI assistants. In our community, which is open source, is growing exponentially and contributing to our capacity to innovate and stay ahead of the market. And overall, when we look at the conversational AI market, the addressable conversational AI market has also grown, and more enterprises are building AI assistants to work on these mission-critical tasks. According to Gartner, the majority of enterprises, about 67%, will be using conversational AI, and chatbots will soon be your most important development activity. And so our mission at RASA, right, is to empower everyone to build and use conversational AI. We have a great community that's, over 12,000 members strong, and we support them. We also have a research team that ships applied research directly into the product so that it works reliably when you use it. But, it's important to know that not all AI assistants are the same, right? Similar to 5 levels of autonomous driving, where you have, different driving levels of automation, AI assistants, the way that we see it, have these 5 levels of complexity too. And as we progress through these 5 levels, assistants become more accommodating of the way that humans think and feel less like an API endpoint. So, let's say you're building a financial assistant whose purpose it is to answer questions about your spending history, pay your credit card bills, transfer money to people and so forth. Let's use that as an example. At each of these levels, we're lowering the burden on the end user to translate what they want into the language of this financial assistant. At level one assistants put all of the work on the end user. So think of static web forms or notification assistants on websites and command line applications. And so the financial assistant might ask you to enter all of this information on a form to get you the assistant that you need. Or, you might ask to enter information to calculate maybe your credit card's interest rate. So that's easier than doing things manually, but the end user still needs to know which inputs to provide and follow a strict format. At level 2, you have basic chatbots. This is something that you've all used, I'm sure. So if a user says something similar to, hey, I'm interested in your credit card offers, the chatbot will then ask them a series of questions, gather that information that they previously had to enter on the website. But level 2 assistants can't handle anything beyond these simple questions. The user can express their goal, which is, maybe they want to transfer money to a friend, or maybe they want to know about credit card offers and things like that, and provide that information in natural language, but they have to behave exactly as the assistant expects. And so if the user deviates from this happy path, the chatbot's going to crash. At level 3, you have contextual assistants. And here the user can ask for clarification. They can say things like, how does the travel credit card compare to the rewards credit card? Or when will my friend receive the money that I just transferred, right? Or how much money did I spend at Starbucks, last week? Oh no, wait, sorry, I changed my mind. How much did I spend on Amazon, right? So they can correct themselves. They can change their mind without derailing the conversation. And the user still has to know exactly what their goal is. They have to know, I want to know about credit cards, or I want to transfer money. Those are things that they have to know. Everything is still what you call an intent, but they no longer have to know how to use the assistant to avoid breaking the conversation. At level 4, you have consultative assistance. So the user can express the situation however they want, and not everything is an intent. So think of, let's say you lose your credit card and you say something like, hey, I lost my credit card. You don't know what you want to do with that, right? You could say your goal could be to replace your credit card. Your goal could be to close your account. It could be many things, but you don't know that yet. And it's the assistant's job to figure out how they can help you, provide options to lock your card, cancel it, send a replacement, whatever the user needs. It's up to the assistant to figure out. Level 5 assistants are adaptive assistants. So the assistant can tease out the details from the user to figure out how to help them. Or maybe the user is very direct with their goal. The assistant has to pick up cues and adjust its behavior based on the user's behavior. So as you can probably guess with these 5 levels, at each level, we're lowering the burden on the end user to translate what they want to do, so that at the end, they're just able to have a conversation to get things done. That's the entire promise of conversational AI, right? Is so that we want to build these interfaces that speak our customers' language so that we can meet customers where they are and allow them to simply have a conversation to get things done on their own terms. So natural language interfaces, therefore, have this ability to be truly transformational. But that doesn't mean that building great conversational AI for the enterprise means that we have to throw everything away that we know about shipping reliable software. In fact, most of the principles that you're already familiar with when it comes to shipping software applications lend themselves incredibly well to conversational AI. So I want to today talk about, what's needed for us to scale conversational AI on an enterprise level, and what are some of the pitfalls and problems that we can avoid in order to build successful AI assistants, regardless of the platform that you're using, right? So one of the biggest challenges with getting value from conversational AI is being able to successfully apply this at scale. So first, let's define what we mean by scale. The most common definition of scale is that when we have a virtual assistant and we roll it out to more users and we grow our user base, right? So as we scale the assistant to support more users, that's also scaling and so forth. And you often start at the POC stage, where you just have a proof of concept, very minimum viable assistant, and then you go to production. And in the process, in addition to scaling to more users, you also expand the scope of your assistant. So let's say you're building this banking assistant. It starts out by answering questions about your bill, and then it scales to paying off your credit card bill, to transferring money to friends, and so forth. So use cases and scope, that kind of scale, is also what we mean when we talk about scale. And so the assistant also gets deployed on more than one channel and scales to expand multiple languages and multiple use cases. And there's other things that you want to consider organizationally. You have 2 teams working on different areas of the bot. They may not know each other's areas or functions or existing intents. Then they may want to have only certain people have access to certain areas of the chatbot. So maybe you want the core team working on the money transfer skills, because it's sensitive data. So they're the only ones with higher privileges, and the rest of the team has lower privileges. So that's another way that we scale in complexity. And then as you scale to multiple bots within your organization, there's an opportunity here to share data, to share generic intents, conversation flows like greeting, goodbye. Those are all common things within your org. So how do you share that kind of common data and increase reusability in your organization? So scale can mean different things. And when you're building successful conversational software for the enterprise, you want to be able to move fast and scale and see measurable value. And so the good news is that most of these things have been figured out already, and hopefully you're already doing much of these things. And like we said before, all of these best practices from shipping good software applications translate really well to conversational AI. But it's really important to follow these best practices and not get caught up in vanity metrics and things that make you feel like you're going faster, make you feel like you're accomplishing a lot. So you might think that generating a lot of synthetic data or data that's made up by developers, I guess what I'm trying to say is that we feel like when we're trying to create chatbots and you need a lot of seed data and initial data, that we can just come up with it. Like I can just generate a whole lot of examples on, hey, this is how users say hello, or this is how users ask to transfer their credit card and so forth. So you might think that generating a lot of this synthetic data is going to make you go faster because you could, sit in a room today and come up with that on yourself. But real conversations are so different than what you or I can come up with. Real users will surprise you and act in ways that you can't anticipate. So learning from these real user conversations, collecting that data and using it to better your assistant will actually make you scale. Using a drag and drop solution or like a black box solution might make you feel like you're going faster, right? But in real use cases, especially enterprise use cases, are unique. It's based on your users, your use case, your way of interacting with your customers and employees. So being able to build on customizable infrastructure and making it your own will actually make you scale in a way that's reliable and robust. So, and the third thing is, sure, it feels fast when you make a change and hit train and deploy right away. But just like you don't ship good software without testing, you can ship AI assistants without reviewing those changes and running automated tests, just like any kind of software application. And separating code and content might make you feel like you're simplifying things, but versioning both together for reproducibility helps you scale. Composing at build time, not at runtime, is another thing that helps you, actually go faster. So one of the best things about conversational AI is that users are literally telling you in their own words what they want, right? Asking for things in a way that you haven't trained and giving you a great opportunity to learn from their behavior. So collect these conversations, of course, in a way that maintains user privacy and follows, privacy ethics, but use these conversations as training data. Successful conversations can become end-to-end tests right away. Successful conversations can become training data right away. But even unsuccessful conversations can tell you a whole lot about what you need to fix, where you need to improve, and maybe the kinds of things that you want to add to your assistant. Because you may think that you know what users say, and when you come up with a bunch of training data yourself and send it off to production, the reality is that you'll be surprised at how users actually talk. They interject, they change their mind, they engage in chit chat, bots will fail, right? Just like I just lost connection right here. But, let's say you're having a conversation with a chatbot, you lose connection, you come back and you want to pick up where you left off, right? So be sure to add training data that is holistic and provides a way for your assistant to learn from that. And so try to follow the process of conversation-driven development, which is learning from user insights and using that to better your assistant, to build robust and scalable conversation products. And so there's 6 steps involved within this process that we like to call conversation-driven development. And regardless of the framework that you're using, you can sort of follow these steps and scale. The first thing is to share. So give your prototype to users as early as possible. People will always surprise you with what they say. Teams will spend months designing conversations that will never happen, or they'll try to over-engineer solutions. So share it with users so that they'll be able to talk to it and learn from it. The second step is review. So take time to read through the conversations that people have with your assistant. And this is something that's helpful at every stage, right? It's from prototype to production. Too many teams get caught up in looking at things exclusively like, hey, what % of my users are expressing this intent? That's not super helpful immediately, but looking at what people are saying and making those adjustments is important. Third step is annotate. So improve your NLU model based on these messages. So when you're building a POC, you can come up with these examples, but as you start to collect this data, try to look at what's working, what's not working, and make adjustments appropriately. Fourth step is to test. So use these conversations to run end-to-end tests for your assistants. And then, of course, it's a natural next step to come up with a way to track successful conversations. Like beyond successfully answering the questions, look at actions and other ways to identify successful and unsuccessful conversations. For example, a user might take an action like signing up for your service, or not taking an action like maybe not getting back in touch with support within 24 hours. He uses data to tag and filter your conversations to understand what's working, what's not working, right? And then of course you want to make sure that you're fixing things as you go along. And what I'm trying to get at is that CDD is a user-centric approach for building AI assistants, and it requires more than just software skills. It's also not a linear process, and you're going to find yourself jumping between each of these actions. And it's a collaborative process between product, design, and development that reveals what users are looking for. And over time, your assistant will adapt to what the user wants rather than expecting your user to adapt to your chatbots. Right? Your use case, your data, and your users are unique, right? So you want to have a customizable infrastructure. That way you can plug and play different language models, integrate with custom channels and internal products. So you can plug and play language models like BERT or GPT-2 into our own NLU architecture called Diet, or you can even bring your own embeddings. Diet, which stands for Dual Intent and Entity Transformer, has been used to train NLU models in 60 languages, right? And so this is especially helpful if you want to make your assistant available in languages other than English or popular European languages. And this is open source, by the way, so if you want to check it out, you can. All right. And the next thing that's important to look at is following best practices like testing your code and having code coverage, because you want to spend your time working on enhancements, right? Like you see on my screen, rather than fixing bugs because you didn't test your code well enough or run enough tests. Reliably share, the load across teams by sharing code and composing at build time. So plan to have shared functionality and growing teams with a narrower focus. And the ultimate goal for enterprise-grade assistants today is to scale successfully so that you're able to get to those adaptive assistants that don't act like an API endpoint. Rather, they're able to adapt to your users' needs and behavior. And when you're in the process of doing that, right, you often start at the POC stage, and then you slowly go to production before you grow your user base, grow your teams that work on these applications and have the ability to share data between applications and so forth. All of these things, right, that you want to do. And as you go through this process, you're going to run into some challenges. So I want to spend some time talking about what those very common challenges are and how you can, plan ahead or try to avoid them. And we've talked with our customers, with market research analysts, experienced some of this ourselves when, we were building chatbots. And some of the ones that we see a lot are meeting security standards and mandates. For conversational AI applications to be in production in an enterprise setting, they're required to meet enterprise security standards. These standards can be particularly challenging as they deal with all of the layers of the open systems interconnection model, which is, your entire hardware and software stack. Integration with third-party services can also be quite cumbersome. Getting your assistant to execute actions on your behalf is one of the most rewarding things that you can do when you're designing and building these applications, right? But it can be quite overwhelming to integrate with several third-party services based on your assistant's domain. It can get complicated really quick, but it doesn't have to be. Enterprises might also have varying DevOps expertise, and so you might not know when or if you need DevOps, but it's always helpful to include them early in the process. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And your application, like we talked about, will scale. It'll scale with your users in complexity and scope. So it's important to ensure a great customer experience throughout. So, let's talk a little bit about how we can plan ahead with security mandates, right? You need to think about secure storage, data privacy, and access controls, among other things. And enterprise security standards depend on the type of infrastructure or platform that you use to deploy your assistant. So when it comes to secure storage, some platforms like Kubernetes come with out-of-the-box support for injecting credentials, and environment variables in a secure manner, while other platforms like bare metal or VM might need custom solutions. And some enterprises might even mandate using a service like Vault to manage sensitive configurations and credentials. So make sure that you're planning ahead for those types of things. With regards to data privacy, security mandates will tell you how to secure data in motion. And this is, I'm sure you know, typically done using transport layer security and HTTPS when services need to communicate with each other and with the outside world. So if TLS is a mandatory requirement, certificate management will be something that you'll need to configure. If you're using Kubernetes, you might want to use a package like Cert Manager or make certificate management more seamless. Another common strategy that we see used in Kubernetes environments is to expose Rasa services via ingress. And this has out-of-the-box support, right, for TLS termination, service load balancing, and so forth. So we talked about, data in motion. Enterprises will also require you to make sure that the conversation data be secured at rest. And since data persistence is typically delegated to databases, especially that's how it works in Rasa, use the built-in encryption capabilities of these databases to secure the conversation data at rest. When it comes to authentication and authorization, single sign-on is like a de facto standard in most enterprises. So make sure that your platform, whatever you're using, supports SAML-based SSO or some kind of SSO. So make sure you enable that to prevent unauthorized access. And if you're using Rasa, you'll know that, it's important to know that Rasa adheres to the principle of least privilege in the form of RBAC or role-based access control. And you can manage the roles and permissions to ensure that users are given appropriate privileges. And you can control how your team works and which team works on what and so forth. And so DevOps is a pretty important part of software development. And for those of us that aren't too familiar, DevOps is a set of practices, culture, and tools that help you deliver software applications at scale. But sometimes, there's a wide variation in the level of DevOps expertise in companies, and this can cause a few problems and ultimately delays in getting assistance to production. So all of the best practices when it comes to typical software development still apply here. So having a conversational team with DevOps representation that, sets up a CI/CD pipeline, that runs automated tests, that versions both code and content can ensure a continuous and scalable delivery to production. You can actually start to add way more value to your assistant when you can get it to do mission critical tasks in a reliable way. And for that, you're going to need to integrate with third-party services. And this problem, or this process rather, can get complicated, right? It requires some planning. So you definitely want to start by planning out your integration points based on your assistant's domain. So start narrow with maybe one or two absolutely needed integrations. So for example, if 40% of your users ask your assistant if it can make a credit card payment on their behalf, then you might want to add this skill or action. So build these skills as question answers first, and then based on traction, implement like an integration strategy as an actual user goal, which is something that the user wants to do. So if you optimize your integration strategy based on what users ask for, then you end up building something that will actually help them. So coming up with like a data-driven approach is important, that we're not over-engineering solutions. And it's always a best practice to follow the single responsibility principle, right, when you're creating these custom actions. And one of the challenges with building these resilient AI applications is that it's impossible to anticipate all of the things that users can say to it, right? This is especially true when the assistant's scope or user base expand. And as more and more users start interacting with your assistant, or teams start to support additional capabilities and conversation paths, the chances that your assistant mishandles user requests will become higher. And so you still need to ensure that your assistant adapts to what your users say, right? Instead of forcing the user to adapt to pre-programmed conversation paths. And so the best way to scale is to not come up with developer-generated data, but to follow the process of conversation-driven development like we talked about. And as you're starting to do this, it's understandable when your assistant doesn't always know the answer. In fact, it's not going to a lot of the time. But when this happens in a production setting, stakeholders that are unfamiliar with how conversational AI works might get concerned. So there's a few ways to resolve this problem, right? First, ensure that your assistant provides a fallback response. So, if it doesn't know the answer, it has to say something like, hey, sorry, I can't help you with that. I don't know how to do that just yet. Instead of just not responding or crashing. And then try to disambiguate what the user says by prompting the user to say it a different way, right? And then maybe another step is to come up with a specific fallback response, right? So if, what you see on my screen here, if, the assistant can't answer when the user's next credit card bill is due, it should say something like, hey, I don't know that yet, but maybe someone on my team can reach out to you, right? And you also want to make sure that you're identifying these successful and unsuccessful conversations at scale, right? So how do you find out where users drop off, why they drop off, and what you can do to fix that? So, we came up with a way to provide some proactive filters, things like notifications to review new conversations where a fallback action is triggered, free text search, and so forth. So that way you're able to identify when fallbacks are triggered and how to solve them. And then we're also trying to incorporate all of this research into our dialogue policy so that we can detect where an unexpected intent was expressed at any point in the conversation. But ultimately, to get to level 3 and beyond, we really have to reinvent the way that conversational AI works, right? The ultimate goal of why we're all here today is that we want to build something that's level 3 and beyond that can support natural multi-turn conversations at scale. And to get there, we have to come up with a different way to think about how to build really good conversational software. And one of the main blockers and challenges that still remains is that not every user message is an intent. So how do we handle that? Let's say that we have a user talking to their banking assistant, right? They just lost their credit card like we talked about. We don't know what the intent is when they say, hey, I lost my credit card, because there's no goal associated with that, right? Or if I'm asking you a question and you say, I'm not sure, you don't know if that falls within the yes intent or the no intent, right? So a big problem with assistants being able to handle something like this, and this is still an experimental feature, that's in Rasa open source, is end-to-end learning, right? What do we do when not everything falls into a neatly defined pre-programmed intent? So instead of a two-step process where all conversational AI works is first looks at the user's intent, what they're trying to accomplish, and then based on that, it sends a response. So it's a two-step process. But with end-to-end learning, Rasa can now directly predict the next action or the next response that the assistant should take by looking at what the user sent. So if I see something like, I'm not sure, or if I see something like, I lost my credit card, then try to find out what their goal should be and respond with that, as opposed to trying to figure out what intent it falls under. And if we follow these best practices and avoid these pitfalls, we really have the ability to build something that will actually help users, something that will deliver measurable value. I really believe that natural language interfaces truly have the potential to change the way that we work, the way that our customers interact with our businesses, because all they have to say is, start a conversation. There's no onboarding necessary, and you're able to really understand the way they think, understand the way that they interact with others, and help them in a way that can be truly transformational. So with that, thank you for being here. I hope you enjoyed this talk. And let's take some questions.
Thank you, Maddie. This was super entertaining, very engaging presentation. I really appreciate your lean approach for this way of explaining the conversation-driven development that you build and measure and go on. And we may have a lot of questions for you, but before we start, I want to remind the audience to vote for you, to share the opinion that they had of your talk on the polls. And then without further ado, we can go on with the questions. I have here a question from Gerald, and he's asking, how do you label the data from the real conversation? So do you have, or do you find yourself using some tools or features that are more useful than others? So what's your experience with that?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? And I'll talk about what we do within Raza, but I'm sure there's like other open source tools out there that you can use. We have a tool called Raza X, which is a browser-based tool that allows you to, build, test, hook up your application to a CI/CD pipeline, and then take a look at all of these conversations right here in the UI. In addition to Raza Open Source, which lets you, interact with your assistant via command line. So it's closed source, but it's free. You can, check it out, download it. Here on my screen, what you see here is all of the conversations that I have coming in. And then I can annotate that data by marking correct conversations, by assigning each of these user inputs to a particular intent, or maybe I want to add a response, so I can fix, add it to an intent, probably tag the entities here and annotate it like this right here in the UI. And you can train it there as well.
Handy dandy. So let's move to poll question then. How are you currently learning from the failed conversation?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few ways that you can do this, right? First of all, you have to define what failure means to your use case. Is it just not, successfully answering a question? Is it not, you say something, the user says something and your bot was supposed to answer that, it doesn't answer that, that's failed, right? Or right when it triggers fallback. So you have to figure out what that sort of failure means for your use case. And depending on that, if it is just the matter of identifying when the fallback intent was triggered, you can do that in the UI, right? You can search here in Raza X for whenever the fallback intent was triggered. And then you can take a look at why it failed. If it incorrectly identifies an intent or mishandles it, you can correct that also by assigning it to the right intent, maybe adding some more training data so that way it's able to recognize. Maybe, it was in the middle of a conversation that it failed, that the user abandoned the conversation maybe. So try to figure out why and how that happened and add more dialogues and end-to-end conversations to teach your bot how to handle some of those sub-dialogues better. So there's a few ways that after you define what failure means, you can start to, fix, add more training data, and then obviously run a whole lot of tests to make sure that it's reliable.
Maybe building on that, would you like to tell us if you have some specific metrics that you usually look for? Because in your presentation, you were mentioning that you check when the user is leaving, so when the conversation is no more efficient. But are there other things that are important?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's high-level metrics, right? There's high-level metrics like user retention. Sure, you open it up to users, they're coming back to talk to your assistant, but maybe only 5 of them are coming back. There's not a whole lot of user retention. User abandonment rate, at what rate are users abandoning your chatbot after saying hi, after asking the first question, and not even waiting for an answer. So look at those high-level metrics. And then you can also look at some lower-level metrics is, incorrect answers, mishandled intents, like abandoning after, check for user behavior and user engagement signals. Maybe they're not clicking on something that they're supposed to click on. So try to look at those lower level metrics as well. And on the NLU side, obviously we have NLU metrics like accuracy rate, and all these other NLU model metrics that you also want to look at.
Very flexible. We have instead Miklos that's asking you whether you can share your thoughts on the difficulties that comes from multilingual approach. So what are the main challenges nowadays, and especially when it comes to building an AI from different languages, and maybe how do you go against these challenges?
Yeah, for sure. Great question, because our mission really is to enable everyone to build good conversational AI. And that everyone doesn't mean people that only speak English or popular European languages, right? So building multilingual assistance is challenging because, first of all, your platform has to support that. Within Raza, you can specify right in your language model what language it's supposed to be, whether that's English or Vietnamese or Thai or Hindi or so forth. You can do that. Another challenge is that there's a whole lot more data, which I'm sure not surprising, a whole lot more English data, right?
Definitely.
As opposed to data that you can find in Vietnamese or Thai or Arabic or what have you. We have open sourced something called NLU examples, which is just training data that's crowdsourced, that's open sourced in lots of different languages. And our community is great because we have our community all over the world that's helping us add to this. So having reliable, good quality training data in those languages can be challenging, but I'm confident that as the conversational AI community is growing, more and more people are outsourcing their data sets. So that can be another challenge look for those data sets and try to get around it that way. So those are two of the most, I guess, popular or more, not popular, but common challenges that we see when it comes to building multilingual assistance. Yeah, I guess try to find a platform and training data that supports that. And, these large scale language models like BERT and GPT-2 and GPT-3 are great, right? Because they're super accurate. They're also open dialogue systems. You can ask the bot anything, or you can ask the language model anything. But a huge drawback is that over 90% of the training data is in English. So that's not very inclusive when you're trying to build a bot in another language and you're trying to make use of that. Yeah, Diet, which is our language model, is also open source. Architecture, rather, it's also open source, and it supports 60 languages today. So feel free to give that a go.
Quite impressive. We have also Jolt asking about multilingual. In this case, he is asking whether you have a use case, so something you worked for instance, in some massively multilingual countries, like in Switzerland, or where people sometimes change from one language to another in the middle of the conversation. And so can you prepare chatbot for this kind of scenarios?
Yeah, good question. I'll take the first one because there's two parts to this. I'll answer the first one first, which is we have a lot of customers in Europe and Latin America and other places. So there is a need to offer a chatbot both in English and in German, or English and in Spanish, and so forth. So the same bot that's able to, and that's why we talked about scale in that way, is because scale isn't just having more users, it's also being able to support the same assistant on different interfaces, different web chat, Slack, Facebook Messenger, what have you, different channels, and in different languages, right? So your users should be able to talk to it wherever they are, in whatever language that they use. So you should be able to do that with this platform and with other platforms too, I'm sure. As with the question about, what happens if you switch in the middle, if you were to have like global intents, maybe like language intents, so your bot, if it identifies another language, switches to that, German or French language model, and then switches back to English. So there isn't a way to do that out of the box, but if you were to set a flag and use some business logic, some decision logic, and code that yourself, you should be able to do that. Raza is pretty customizable, so you can create what's called a custom action that allows you to create global intents and switch between language models and do something like that. I haven't tried it, but I mean, that's how I would maybe think about it. But, if you want to give that a go, feel free to do that, and then go to our forum, forum.raza.com, and then tell us about it. I'm sure there's others in the community that are also eager to know.
Yeah, sounds like a quite interesting topic. Building on Switzerland, actually, I had the questions regarding a previous speaker we had. I was working with banking, and you were mentioning in your discussion how you should go with real user conversation, right? But what happens when you cannot have this kind of data? So do you think that the way you are handling security and the separation of concern you have in your own platform can help somehow with this?
Yeah, I know I touched a little bit upon like privacy ethics and what you can store, what kind of conversations you can't. you should obviously be following whatever rules based in your industry, your country, what have you. There should be a way to anonymize and scrub the data too, though. If a user is providing sensitive data like their account information or names or PII, then you can find a way to scrub it and then anonymize it. That way you're still able to collect data that's anonymized, data that's just training phrases like, hey, I want to open a credit card, but like, 100 different ways to say that, and then use that and then train using that. So I would probably try that approach, is anonymize and scrub it. Another good thing about Raza is that it's pretty secure and Gdpr compliant. Your data is your own. Like no one at Raza would have access to it because it's deployed on your servers. It belongs with you. It's your data. And yeah, if you wanted to scrub it, anonymize it, and make sure that you're following privacy ethics, then that's obviously what we strongly recommend too.
Thank you. That's a quite extensive reply. I'm checking the chat whether we have some other user that I'm stealing the time from by making my own questions, but it doesn't seem so. Maybe you want to touch a bit more on the reusability aspect. So at what level are you right now that you can recycle pieces of chatbots, and have you experiment with maybe something like that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in Raza, you obviously have intents and all of the training phrases associated with a particular intent. We also have what we call our stories, which is just conversation paths and different ways a conversation could go. And all of that, is in YAML format, YAML training data format, in your command line and also in Raza X. So you can export those intents and those generic stories, and very quickly add them to another bot that also, definitely has to go through, introducing itself, saying goodbye, saying hello, all of these common things, and then add it that way. That way you're able to really share data across bots, and then reuse things and go to market faster and not have to build all of this stuff from scratch.
Yeah, let's not reinvent the wheel. Makes sense. Okay, I think I run out of question and of time.